Lamb to the Slaughter by Roald Dahl. The room was warm and clean, the curtains drawn. Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again she would glance up at the clock, merely to please herself with the thought that each minute gone by made it nearer to the time when he would come home. There was a slow, smiling air about her. When the clock said 10 minutes to 5, she began to listen, and a few moments later, punctually as always, she laid aside her sewing, stood up, and went forward to kiss him as he came in. "Hello, darling," she said. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and made the drinks, and soon she was back again in her chair with her sewing, and he in the other, holding the tall glass with both hands, rocking it so that the ice cubes tinkled against the side. "Tired, darling?" "Yes," he said, and as he spoke, he did an unusual thing. He lifted his glass and drained it in one swallow, although there was still half of it, at least half of it, left. He paused a moment, leaning forward in the chair. Then he got up and went slowly over to fetch himself another. When he came back, she noticed that the new drink was dark amber with a quantity of whisky in it. She watched him as he began to sip the dark yellow drink, and she could see little oily swirls in the liquid because it was so strong. "I think it's a shame," she said, "that when a policeman gets to be as senior as you, they keep him walking around on his feet all day long." He didn't answer, so she bent her head again and went on with her sewing. "Darling," she said, "would you like me to get you some cheese? I haven't made any supper because it's Thursday." "No," he said. "If you're too tired to eat out," she went on, "well, there's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer." Her eyes waited on him for an answer, a smile, a little nod, but he made no sign. "Anyway," she went on, "I'll get you some cheese and crackers first." "I don't want it," he said. She moved uneasily in her chair, the large eyes still watching his face. "Oh, but you must eat. I'll fix it anyway, and then you can have it, or not, just as you like." She stood up and placed her sewing on the table by the lamp. "Sit down," he said. "Oh, just for a minute, sit down." It wasn't until then that she began to get frightened. She lowered herself back slowly into the chair, watching him all the time with those large, bewildered eyes. He had finished the second drink and was staring down into the glass, frowning. "Listen," he said, "I've got something to tell you." He had now become absolutely motionless, and she noticed that there was a little muscle moving near the corner of his left eye. "This is going to be a bit of a shock to you, I'm afraid, but I thought about it a good deal, and I've decided that the only thing to do is to tell you right away. I hope you won't blame me too much." And he told her. It didn't take long, 4 or 5 minutes at most, and she sat very still through it all, watching him with a kind of dazed horror as he went further and further away from her with each word. "So there it is," he added. "Of course I'll give you money and see that you're looked after, but there needn't really be any fuss." Her first instinct was not to believe any of it, to reject it all. Maybe if she went about her business and acted as though she hadn't been listening, she might find that none of it had ever happened. "I'll get supper," she managed to whisper, and this time he didn't stop her. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all. Everything was automatic now. Her hand inside the cabinet taking hold of the first object it met, she lifted it out and looked at it. A leg of lamb. She carried it upstairs, and as she went through to the living room, she saw him standing over by the window with his back to her, and she stopped. "For God's sake," he said, hearing her but not turning round. "Oh, don't make supper for me. I'm going out." At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him, and without any pause, she swung the big frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. She might as well have hit him with a steel club. She stepped back a pace, waiting. Then he crashed to the carpet. The violence of the crash helped bring her out of the shock. She stood for a while blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight in both hands. "All right," she told herself. "So I've killed him." It was extraordinary now how clear her mind became all of a sudden. As the wife of a detective, she knew quite well what the penalty would be. She carried the meat into the kitchen, placed it in a pan, turned the oven on high, and shoved it inside. Then she ran upstairs to the bedroom. She sat before the mirror and tidied her hair. She tried a smile. It came out rather peculiar. She tried again. "Hello, Sam," she said brightly, aloud. The voice sounded peculiar too. "I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, and I think a can of peas." That was better. Then she ran downstairs, took her coat, went out the back door, and into the street. It wasn't 6 o'clock yet, and the lights were still on in the grocery shop. "Hello, Sam," she said brightly, smiling at the man behind the counter. "Why, good evening, Mrs. Maloney. How are you?" I want some potatoes, please, Sam. Yes, and I think a can of peas. Patrick decided he's tired and doesn't want to eat out tonight, she told him. We usually go out on Thursdays, you know, and Harry's caught me in the house without any vegetables. Then how about meat, Mrs. Maloney? No, I've got meat, thanks. I've got a nice leg of lamb. You want these Idaho potatoes? Oh, yes, that'll be fine. And when it was all wrapped up and she had paid, she put on her brightest smile and said, Thank you, Sam. Good night. Good night, Mrs. Maloney, and thank you. And now, she told herself as she hurried back, all she was doing now, she was returning home to her husband, and he was waiting for his supper. And if, when she entered the house, she happened to find anything unusual or tragic or terrible, then naturally it would be a shock and she'd become frantic with grief and horror. Mind you, she wasn't expecting to find anything. She was just Mrs. Patrick Maloney going home with the vegetables on a Thursday evening to cook supper for her husband. Therefore, when she entered the kitchen, she was humming a little tune to herself and smiling. Patrick, she called, how are you, darling? She put the parcel down on the table and went through into the living room. And when she saw him lying there on the floor, it really was rather a shock. All the old love and longing for him welled up inside her, and she ran over to him and began to cry her heart out. It was easy. No acting was necessary. A few minutes later, she got up and went to the phone. She knew the number of the police station, and when the man at the other end answered, she cried to him, Oh, quick, come quick! Patrick's dead! Who's speaking? Mrs. Patrick Maloney! You mean Patrick Maloney's dead? He's lying on the floor, and I think he's dead. Be right over, the man said. When she opened the front door, 2 policemen walked in. She knew them both, and she fell right into Jack Noonan's arms, weeping hysterically. He put her gently into a chair, and then went over to join O'Malley, who was kneeling by the body. Is he dead? She cried. I'm afraid he is. What happened? Briefly, she told her story about going out to the grocer and coming back to find him on the floor. While she was talking, Noonan discovered a small patch of congealed blood on the dead man's head. He showed it to O'Malley, who got up at once and hurried over to the phone. Soon other men began to come into the house. First a doctor, then 2 detectives. Later, a police photographer arrived and took pictures, and a man who knew about fingerprints. There was a great deal of whispering and muttering beside the corpse, and the detectives kept asking her a lot of questions. She told her story again, this time right from the beginning, when Patrick had come in, and he was so tired that he hadn't wanted to go out to supper. She told how she put the meat in the oven. It's there now, cooking. And how she'd stepped out to the grocer for vegetables, and came back to find him lying on the floor. Which grocer? One of the detectives asked. She told him, and he turned and whispered something to the other detective, who immediately went outside into the street. In 15 minutes he was back with a page of notes, and there was more whispering. After a while the photographer and the doctor departed, and 2 other men came in and took the corpse away on the stretcher. The 2 detectives remained, and so did the 2 policemen. Jack Noonan asked if she wouldn't rather go somewhere else. No, she said. She didn't feel like she could even move a yard at that moment. A little later, perhaps, she would move. So they left her there for a while, and they went about their business, searching the house. They were looking for the weapon. It's the old story, he said. Get the weapon and you got the man. Later, one of the detectives came up and sat beside her. Did she know of anything in the house that could have been used as a weapon? A very big spanner, for example, or a heavy metal vase? They didn't have any heavy metal vases, she said. Or a big spanner? She didn't think they had a big spanner, but there might be some things like that in the garage. The search went on. It began to get late, nearly 9, and she noticed by the clock on the mantel. The 4 men searching the room seemed to be growing weary and a trifle exasperated. Jack, she said, the next time Sergeant Noonan went by, would you mind giving me a drink? Sure, I'll give you a drink. You mean this whiskey? Yes, please, but just a small one. It might make me feel better. Why don't you have one yourself? She said. Oh, you must be awfully tired. Well, he answered, it's not strictly loud, but I might just take a drop to keep me going. Sergeant Noonan wandered into the kitchen and came out quickly and said, Oh, look, Mrs. Maloney, you know that oven of yours is still on and the meat's still inside. Oh, dear me, she cried. I'd better turn it off for you, hadn't I? Oh, thank you so much. When the sergeant returned the second time, she looked at him with her large, dark, tearful eyes. Jack Noonan? Yes. Would you do me a small favour, you and these others? We can try, Mrs. Maloney. Well, she said, you must be terribly hungry by now, because it's long past your supper time, and I know Patrick would never forgive me if I allowed you to remain in the house without offering you decent hospitality. Why don't you eat up the lamb that's in the oven? It'll be cooked just right by now. Wouldn't dream of it, Sergeant Noonan said. Oh, please, it'd be a favour if you'd eat it up. There was a good deal of hesitating amongst the 4 policemen, but they were clearly hungry, and in the end they were persuaded to go into the kitchen and help themselves. The woman stayed where she was, listening to them speaking amongst themselves. Have some more, Charlie. Nah, better not finish it. Oh, she wants us to finish it. She said so. If you do know a favour. Okay then, give me some more. That's a hell of a big club the guy must have used to hit poor Patrick, one of them was saying. The doc says his skull was smashed all to pieces like from a sledgehammer. Whoever done it, they're not going to be carrying a thing like that round with them any longer than they need. Personally, I think it's here on the premises, probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Jack? And in the other room, Mary Maloney began to giggle.